There we go. Right, just very briefly then, I'm going to have to take you on a journey that you probably are not terribly aware of. Right, South Africa is one of the most biodiversity-rich countries in the world, and I'm going to be talking just about a tiny fraction of that. I presume all of you know that next year is the year of biodiversity, and I'm going to be talking just a little bit about what biodiversity actually means to us. South Africa is the third most biodiversity-rich country in the world, and this is usually based on plants. But if you think that every species of plant has 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 or 50 species of insects associated with it, that's actually, we get to orders of magnitude more of insect biodiversity. This is a quote by one of, unfortunately, there's some of it is lost here, but this is E.O. Wilson, who was the winner of the TED Prize in 2007. And he said that if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed only 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos because they're the small things that control the world, not politicians. So we have a 70% rule that I just use. It's a sort of a thumbsuck, but anyway, that 70% of all animals are insects, 70% of all insects are beetles, 70% of all indigenous plants, so this is our biodiversity. The rich fynbos fauna, one of the 6 plant kingdoms of the world. Most of those plants are pollinated by insects. No plants, no insects. 70% of all wood, grass, etc. If you've ever wondered what happens to the grass and sticks and logs and whatnot that fall onto the ground, they're eventually composed mainly by insects. And then the topic I'll be talking about this afternoon, 70% of all dung produced is removed by insects and mainly dung beetles. And then just as an aside, 40% of all animal carcasses, even in a place like the Kruger National Park, the size of an impala, about 50 kilograms or so, are never found by vertebrate scavengers. They're eaten by insects. Now, I try to combine the research, which has been my passion for about 40 years or so, with training, education, of course, which is our brief at the university is to train people. But I like to take it a little further than just teaching them about what insects do. So we go back to some of the mythology and that sort of thing that's come a long way with humans. Dung beetles have been associated with humans for about the last 6,000 years or so, the sacred scarab of ancient Egypt. Of course, there's enough in the subject for many hours of discussion, but anyway, I'm just going to mention 2 of the brief points about dung beetles and the fact that they were revered in the mythology was that they represented 2 basic elements. The one was that the Egyptians saw dung beetles rolling balls across the ground, and this epitomized the sun god Ra, or represented the sun god Ra rolling the sun across the heavens to them, so it was very important, obviously. The second was that the dung beetles represented the immortal soul, because they saw dung beetles rolling balls, burying the balls. They assumed that the dung beetle was dying, because when people die, they get buried, but then they noticed that they reappeared again sometime later. So to this represented reincarnation and the immortal soul. And they thought that the dung beetles were dying, but then were being resurrected. And all of this was then worked into the mythology. Now, when you tell people that you do what? You work on dung beetles, this is sort of the reaction we get. Oh, Criminy Warren, it's the dung beetles, and they've got their you-know-what with them. My parents were very worried that I'd ever find a job, and I must admit I've probably had the most wonderful job ever. Lots of my university friends who ended up becoming much more lucrative professionals envy me the freedom that it's given me to travel all over the world and study things like the African bagel beetle. Just back to the mythology then, one of the chief gods was called Khepri, which is one of the scientific names for all beetles. The ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian is Khepris, and one of the manifestations of the famous, the most senior Greek gods was one of these manifestations with the dung beetle head. And you may have seen it in books and art. European museums are full of this sort of thing. A lot of the hieroglyphics, you see people worshipping the sacred scarab and this sort of thing, and all sorts of amulets and jewelry and all that sort of thing. There's a whole lot of this in various museums all over the world. Just a little bit about the general biology that we need to bring to your attention. Just by looking at a dung beetle, you can immediately see the front of the head is tooth-shaped for cutting chunks out of the dung. The legs have spines for digging. Those of you who do your own gardening will know it's easier to dig with a fork than it is with a spade. And then they have these big Schwarzenegger-type chests because this is where all the flight muscles and the walking muscles are housed in these big chests. And then they have special sensory organs, of course, because they need to get it while it's hot. They feed on the liquid components of dung. It's fiercely contested. You need to be the first to get there. So they have these on the antennae, which are the sense organs. They have thousands of little sensory organs so that they can smell dung at vast distances. And then those are the mouth parts. Those of you who remember your standard 6 biology will remember that most insects, grasshoppers and that sort of thing, have sickle-shaped mandibles for cutting and chewing. Dung beetles feed on liquid components of the dung, so they need spatulate, soup-like, a ladle-like mandibles. You don't eat soup with a fork. Dung beetles have known that for some time. And then to stop them from breaking their teeth, they have little filters on the end because, of course, the dung's full of sticks and sand and all this sort of thing. Right, then you can also tell just by looking at a dung beetle what it's likely to do. The one on the left is a ball roller. You may remember from Jock of the Bushveld. There was all that fuss about dung beetles being drawn, showing their balls, pushing their balls. Well, in fact, they actually do, but most of them roll them backwards. So they have these long legs. Those of you who remember your Greek mythology will remember that there was a fellow called Sisyphus who fiddled with Zeus's wife or daughter or mother or somebody. So he was banished to the underworld to roll rocks up an incline in perpetuity. So the early entomologist who saw the small dung beetle rolling this disproportionately massive ball up a steep incline, struggling like anything, reminded him of Sisyphus rolling these rocks up an incline, so he named it Sisyphus. The one on the right there you can see couldn't roll balls if it tried. We'll get to that. People assume that dung beetles live in this grubby environment, so they're automatically pretty grubby too. They're not. Many of them are spectacularly beautiful. They have all these lovely structures and this sort of thing. Whoops, one of them got lost. But anyway, this is what happens when you convert to Mac. We have 3 basic types of dung beetles. This is the T from TED, remember? So we have 3 different basic types of dung beetles in South Africa. The ones that are familiar to many people who go to the field, to Kruger Park and that sort of thing, are the ball rollers, the ones that roll balls, usually very visible. But only about 10 or 15% of the dung beetles, 700 to 800 species in South Africa, not just the dung beetle, 700 or 800 species in South Africa. About 10 or 15% of them are rollers. About 5% or so live inside the dung, never come out and are generally visible. And then the bulk, this one over here, though the most common, usually about 70 or 80% of our dung beetles are these tunnelers. They fly in, you don't see much of them above ground, they tunnel down under the ground, and then they carry dung down below. Just this is a sight that's familiar to many people. If you've ever watched dung beetles, like the bagel beetle watchers, watching a dung beetle, you'll see that there are often 2 dung beetles. The one appears to be doing everything and the other one appears to be doing nothing. Now this is great for the sexists amongst us because the one doing all the work is the male. And the one sitting on top is the female, and it's giving the backseat driver, a little to the left, a little to the right, you're going too fast. The female does nothing except ride. You're going to get your chance. You're going to get your chance. The male does all the work until the ball is buried. So the male rolls the ball, buries the ball, and then mating takes place, and now the ladies get their chance. After the male is mated with the female, he then abandons the brood. The female then remains and stays, for, in some cases, up to 5 months underground, caring for the brood, talking to the babies, rolling the balls, cleaning them, and this sort of thing. Now, there's a simple evolutionary reason for it. Of course, the male invests all his energy in forming the ball, rolling the ball, and that sort of thing, and getting it to a suitable place to bury. After mating, he can get out and replenish his energy supplies. The female remains underground for 5 months or so, so she doesn't invest any energy in this fairly crude part of the process, but she remains underground for the 5 months without feeding while she looks after the progeny. Just some that used to occur around Joburg and probably still do on the outskirts. A pair of dung beetles about the size of a matchbox each form these balls about the size of a tennis ball. They can form 10 or 12 of those balls, bury about 5 kilograms of dung overnight. The life cycle is mostly happens inside the ball, so the female lays the egg, then a larva develops. I don't know how many of you remember the cycle. You kept earthworm, at least, well, that's what happens when you listen. You kept silkworms. You'll remember that there's a larval stage and a pupal stage. How many closet silkworm breeders are there still amongst us? You're allowed to admit it. So then there's a larval stage and a pupal stage, and then the adult stage emerges. All of this happens underground. Right, now just to get to the environmental importance of dung beetles. This is known as the infinite dung theorem. Big dung beetles produce dung, and smaller dung beetles feed on the smaller dung, and smaller dung beetles feed on the smaller dung beetles' dung, smaller dung beetles feed on the smaller dung beetles' dung eventually. So infinite dung theorem, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but of course our dung beetles do feed on everything from elephant dung right down to lizard and bird dung and that sort of thing, with everything in between. They vary in size from 60 or 70 millimeters down to 1 millimeter in size. Right, now this is the South African situation. If you take cattle, one cow produces 12 cow pats. They weigh on average of 3 kilograms each. That's 36 cow pats per day. 10 million cows produce 120 million cow pats per day. That's 6,000 whatever tons of dung per day. We would be up to here if it wasn't for dung beetles. What's become of it? And then, of course, there are 10,000 elephants in the Kruger Park, each one producing 150 kilograms a day. So 10,000 times 150. 30 million sheep. How many politicians? All contributing. So this is what happens to dung. This is 30 minutes after a cow pat was deposited. Another 30 minutes later, the party's over. All buried, many holes in the ground, dung's buried, water can penetrate, fly eggs that are deposited in there get dried out, so you find that the whole ecosystem is managed by these small ecosystem managers. Then the question is always, what would happen if we didn't have dung beetles? I always have this question, what use is a cockroach? What would the world be without dung beetles? This is what the world would be like. This is what Australia looks like. You know where Australia is? Where they play bad cricket and rugby. Australia is an island that only used to have convicts and kangaroos. And then in 1788, Europeans introduced cattle. There are now 30 million cattle in Australia, producing 12 cow pats times 3 times... So, and this is what it looks like, because the dung beetles they had in Australia couldn't cope with cattle dung because they were used to the dung produced by kangaroos, which are small and dry. So they had a massive problem. Firstly, the place was covered in dung. So the island was about to sink. And then they introduced dung beetles from South Africa. Just like they introduced our best businessmen like Barry of Ponzi fame, they also introduced dung beetles from South Africa. Now, the problem was not only one of the physical covering of the pastures. You can see what it looks like. The other one was that there were two types of flies that breed in it. One is nuisance flies. You can see on that child's legs and on this woman, and them sitting on the leaves there. And as the farmers say, flies have some good points. On a hot day, you can stand in their shade. The crocodile Dundee hats with the corks on and all that sort of thing, and the Australian salute, "G'day, mate." That's to keep the nuisance flies away from their faces. But there's a second fly that's of even worse. It makes cattle unhappy. They suck blood. It's like having that many mosquitoes sucking your blood. Tens of thousands of flies make it. So, of course, it's mainly an agricultural country like South Africa, Australia is. So there was a massive problem with cattle becoming, look at the nuisance value, losing condition and all this sort of thing. So this is when the project started to import dung beetles from South Africa. They started in 1969, and it lasted for about 20 years or so before the project finally... how are we doing? For 3 minutes. So I can just slow down a little bit. The problems were, of course, firstly, the nuisance value. I actually asked Alicia for 3 days for this talk, but she said 15 minutes at most. So there's this the nuisance value of flies. So dung beetles were actually, and this is serious, people don't believe me, but we had a dung beetle research unit in Pretoria, an Australian CSIRO dung beetle research unit that bred dung beetles and exported the eggs to Australia, where they were put into little artificial dung balls, and then the dung beetles were reared and they were given to farmers. And when in 1989 Australia pulled out for political reasons, the dung beetle program in Australia collapsed. One clever technician who had been working there then collected his own, and he breeds them in his garage. And he now sells them, and farmers are happy to buy them. And those of you who go to visit our friends in Australia, if you go to parts of the southeast around Perth, and at least the southwest around Perth, and then the whole of the moister eastern parts of the country from Melbourne up to the Queensland coast, so conditions have improved dramatically since dung beetles were introduced. Right, and then people ask us, well, what are you doing about the problem? Big deal. So one of the things we're doing is we started off putting signs up in some of the national parks. And just we pick on elephant dung because elephants produce a great big pile of dew, 25 to 30 to 40 kilograms at a time. Our record for sitting around the dung pat, collecting and checking dung beetles, is we found 7,000 individuals of 120 different species. So every time you take your new Land Cruiser and roar over dung beetle pats in the Kruger Park, you're going to account for that when you get up to Kepri one day. He's going to say, how many elephant dung pats did you drive over? And then, of course, I've already more or less told you what the situation is on farms. On farms, the problem is much worse because there are interventions, farming interventions that influence dung beetle populations. One of the ones that we've been trying to mitigate for many years now is a lot of the veterinary chemical products that farmers use to control parasites on ticks and internal parasites on livestock. They treat their cattle with all sorts of antiparasitic drugs. These antiparasitic drugs are often excreted in the dung chemically unchanged. So if they're toxic to ticks and toxic to flies and everything else, they're also toxic to dung beetles. So farmers are basically creating a situation in South Africa where by treating their cattle, they are depressing the dung beetle populations. And so we're starting to have a vicious cycle of no dung beetles, no soil enrichment, penetration of water, aeration of the soil, all those advantages, some of which, of course, can also be attributed to earthworms. And for anybody who's interested in reading more about dung beetles, there's lots of literature on South African dung beetles. Thank you very much.